Hi, my name is Bill Degnan, and welcome to the Kennett Classic Computer Museum. This museum is full of interesting exhibits that anybody would be interested in. So come on in and learn more about the history of computing, especially in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware area. We have hundreds of computers that span from the 1950s all the way to the early 1990s. There's a little bit for everybody here, and you can see them working, operating, because it's so important not just to show these computers, but to tell the story and say what these computers did for you. People will see a machine they haven't seen in years, and it will bring all these great memories back to them, and we would love to share that with you today. Okay, prior to World War II, computers were people using devices, adding machines, tabulating machines, but there really weren't computers. Now, we all know about Charles Babbage, and he had his analytic engine, and we know about Hollerith's card punch and card reader, but it really wasn't until World War II that computers actually, as we think of them today, existed. In 1927, you had comptometers that looked like this, and then over time they developed, there's a Burroughs adding machine from closer to maybe the late 30s, but people in World War II needed more computing power, so they started taking all of these things and putting them together. And what they had at their disposal were radio tubes, television tubes, phone company relays, and primitive integrated circuits like diodes, capacitors, and resistors, and really that was about it. So they had to string a lot of electronics together just to accomplish what we today would take for granted in a little tiny chip. So some of those pieces are illustrated here in the museum. We have plug boards, for example. Now, plug boards are very important in the early days of computing. Those were used, for example, to delimit where a first name and a last name might go in a card reader. So as the card punch, a card reader is working through the machine, the plug boards would be used to differentiate or delimit, like the delimiter today, where those would begin and those would end. So that existed. And people would say, oh, you know what we could do is we could take those plug boards and we could use those to turn instructions on and off as well. Why don't we employ that same technology? And IBM was a huge leader in the business machine world already. Let's build a computer. Well, what do we have available? We've got plug boards, so let's use those to do our programming, and that's exactly what they did. So after World War II, the ENIAC computer was commercialized by Remington Rand, who then hired Mauchly and Eckert to build the UNIVAC one. And here we have some actual pieces from that first UNIVAC computer. Now this is just simply part of the something to do with the way that the drum memory is retained in memory, like a RAM memory. You can see DuPont company, this is a uniservo tape. That's how they used to store information. Here's a piece of a controller from a drum memory. And inside of this cabinet, we see tube modules and manuals and so on from various other computers from that time. Now, computer input wasn't as fast as it needed to be. So there had to be a partnership with some of the other older technology of the day, which are analog computers. So analog computing is computing that does not use a machine instruction in order to do the programming. Instead, it's hardwired programming to solve specific math problems or specific types of problems for counting or for trigonometry and so on to calculate slope and make it easier to do calculus. And here's a great example. This is a 1959 Heathkit EC1 trainer and analog computer that's wired up to do the falling body problem. So we're going to turn it on. It's going to fire up the tubes that are inside of it, and the relays, and the amplifiers, and the electricity is going through the capacitors. And then we're going to cheat a little bit, and we're going to plug in a newer oscilloscope and send the voltage from this program that's being solved by the computer into the oscilloscope. So you have to let it fire up there. Now we can see it. Now this is the falling body problem that's in their training manual. And you can see that the voltage declines, and then it's illustrated on the screen. Back in the 50s, this would have been a paper readout, and the technicians would have taken the paper readout, and then they would have calculated the slope. And they may have fed that into their electronic computer in order to actually come up with the final solution or the information. Consider this like the I/O device of the 50s. So you have electronic computers like the UNIVAC and the Burroughs and the IBM 701, 704, and 650, but you needed analog computers also in the 50s because together they gave the complete computing that's starting to become an industry, and it's starting to coalesce into something that actually is solving new and interesting types of problems, such as sending a spaceship into orbit or doing nuclear, making a nuclear plant and so on. The question then is, you see these primitive devices in the museum. How did we get to something like a 1997 Silicon Graphics computer capable of connecting to the internet and serving web pages? How did we get to these handheld devices that are displayed here? These might look primitive to many of you today, but these were cutting edge in 1985, 95 era for doing all kinds of tasks associated with memos and note-taking, and you could do primitive drawing, and you could do primitive calling, and you could do all kinds of computing like your biorhythm or horse race calculating and so on. All those devices have now been replaced by a single smartphone. But the question is, how did we get to there from the 50s? So we're going to take a tour and we're going to see how all that came to be. Computers were big. Computers were huge. Just to air condition 5,000 tubes for the UNIVAC 1 involved a whole other room of air conditioning equipment. So it wasn't really practical to have a computer in your home. The twinkling of the personal computing concept began with this card right here. This card is from the LGP30 by Royal McBee. And you probably never heard of this before, but this is a clock card. And the computer you probably never heard of, but this clock was used. You can see the tubes, you can see the primitive electronics. But this is the precursor to what we call today megahertz and gigahertz in our modern computers. This is the clock. This is the thing that controlled the instructions that enabled the computer to have a governor as to whose turn it was next to send instructions to the computer. So no longer did you need plug boards, no longer did you need hardwired programming, but you could actually have it be free-flowing, and you could actually sit down and write a program yourself. And that's exactly what two gentlemen named Kurtz and Kimmeny did with the LGP30. And it was this computer that inspired them to start the basic programming language, which they did about 8 years afterwards. And Kurtz and Kimmeny said, you know, this would be great. Why don't we put this on a mainframe computer like the GE that they had available to them at Dartmouth University? And let's make a time-sharing basic system so that regular everyday students could sit down and actually use a computer on their own for fun, write whatever programs they wanted to. You have a growing community of people who are really excited about the potential of what you could do with electronics and the whole concept of computing and computers to do things. So you just needed better parts, better stuff. And one of the first things that came about from Bell Labs was a transistor. Now, you've heard about transistor radios, but you might not also know that without a transistor, computer shrinking, making boards smaller, putting more chips on a board and in a computer would not be possible. So you didn't need tubes anymore like you have from a television and a radio. Transistors took the place of those larger, hotter devices. Similarly, memory, RAM memory, started to be improved by the invention of the core memory. And here we have an example of a very early core memory that was donated by Temple University. That core memory was capable of storing 1,000 pieces of information, not bytes, but bits. But core memory continued to evolve, and you can see here some more advanced versions of it. And of course, the companies Burroughs, Honeywell, and IBM continue to make these devices smaller and smaller and smaller and pack more and more information on them, just like they do today. But that race for smallness didn't just start in the 70s with Intel. It started in the 50s with IBM, Burroughs, Honeywell, GE, and all the other companies, and Digital Equipment Corporation. Here you can see some examples of that. And before you knew it, these pieces of hardware and the know-how on how to use them and the improvements made it possible to actually have a computer that you could sit down at and use that was even better than the LGP30. In fact, I have one right here that I can demonstrate for you. Now, all we need to do is operate the front panel to turn on the computer and interface it with the teletype that's sitting next to it. We're going to load the address, we're going to activate the CPU, and we're going to start the computer. Okay, the computer and the teletype are communicating. And there it goes. Now, these teletypes were the most used input-output devices for computing all the way up to about 1977, 78, 79. In 1967, a gentleman put out an article that said, "I used a real computer at home, and so will you." In May of 1967, people are starting to imagine, I can use a computer. They're putting out trainers, such as this one, to teach digital logic. So you have the demand, you have the interest, you have the culture, and you have people ready for them. All you needed was a microprocessor, which was invented, and when you enter this room, you cross into the threshold from the old computing into the world of the microprocessor. And there's no microprocessor more famous than the Intel 8080, and there's no computer more famous that ran an Intel 8080 processor than the Altair 8800 computer. The first bus system for a microprocessor that was successful, there were others, there's always others, but the first one was the S100 bus. And because Altair was not able to produce their computers as quickly, a competing company called IMS, put out its IMSI 8080, which was advertised to be as chip for chip or compatible with the same bus standard that MITS was using on its computer. It was the first clone computer. And you might recognize this computer as the computer that also appears in the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick. In 1977, Radio Shack, Apple Computer, and Commodore Computer all came out in the same year with what we like to today call appliance computers. Computers became an appliance in 1977. It became possible to buy a computer at a Radio Shack, take it home, and have really no working knowledge of the inside of the computer, turn it on, and immediately start working on it. No longer did you have to build a kit. No longer did you have to try to figure out how to engineer your devices and your terminals and whatnot. You actually had graphics, and in the case of Apple, you actually had color. All you had to do was hook it up to a television set, add a cassette player, and everybody had cassette players back then, a couple of cables, and you were ready to go. Sure, there weren't disk drives. Sure, they weren't powerful, but you actually had a computer. You could actually sit down and type a paper. You could actually print something out. You could actually save your work onto a cassette, something that everybody had in their house. It became practical in 1977 to have a computer. Commodore was from Pennsylvania, and they made a great computer. In fact, the Commodore 64 you see here is one of 10 million units that were sold worldwide. And the company that produced it is right here in Pennsylvania. They also made the VIC-20, Super Pet, and other Commodore models. There was 20 different models of Commodore, and we have them all here at Kennett Classic. I hope you enjoyed your tour of Kennett Classic Computer Museum. We're located in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and we're open from Tuesday to Saturday year-round. Our website address is kennettclassic.com. We look forward to seeing you soon.